All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this event on getting to net zero. I think as the full room attests, this is a topic that's inspiring a great amount of curiosity these days. And we are delighted to have such a distinguished group of experts here to help guide us through the questions at hand. So I will be extremely brief. You have bios that have been printed for the speakers at the entrance, and if you need one, feel free to go back and get them. I'll just introduce our speakers by name and affiliation. So first, on the other end of the table, we have Rich Miller, who I should also say is a distinguished alum of the law school. He's at Con Edison. Next, we have Elizabeth Stein, also a distinguished alum of the law school. She's at the Environmental Defense Fund. Beside Elizabeth, we have Richard Kaufman of NYSERDA. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Columbia Global Energy Center, or the Center on Global Energy Policy. And then we have Maritza Okada from Vinson & Elkins, and Dan Egan from Vornado Real Estate. And finally, last but not least, Robert Sieber, also at Vinson & Elkins, and a professor here, an adjunct professor here, where he teaches the course on oil and gas law. So thank you all very much, and I should really thank Vinson & Elkins. We've been in partnership with them doing an event each year now for, I believe, 5 years, and it's really become a moment in the annual calendar that we look forward to very much, and we thank Robert for your leadership on these issues and continued support. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you all for joining us here today. Thank the panelists for joining us. In case you did not bring your telescope, those signs here are supposed to tell who we are, but we will call out the names anyway in case you forgot it after Danielle's introduction. So net zero, what is it about? We are talking about a New York State policy here, or a New York State program that but that took a major step last year when the state legislature passed the Climate Leadership and Community Act, which we will refer to here as the Climate Act. Then the governor then waited a few weeks to sign it, and speculation was he was waiting for a particularly hot day to do that and give a press conference. So we now waited for a particularly mild winter day to discuss it. So what is it about? I will attempt to provide a very brief summary of the major milestones that the Climate Act lays out, and then I will ask our panelists here to weigh in on particular aspects. So there are 10-year milestones, 10 years when you look at it from now, 2020. So the first major milestones are for the year 2030, where the goal for the state is to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions to 60% of 1990 levels. Why 1990? Because that's an international norm for measuring the baseline for greenhouse gas emissions. So the goal is to reduce them to 60% of 99 levels. Another 2030 goal is to procure 70% of electricity from renewable sources. So that's 70% of electricity in 10 years from renewable sources. Then the next major milestone, 10 years later, 2040, for that milestone, the goal is to procure all electricity from emissions-free resources. Note that 2030 is 70% from renewable. 2040 is all from emissions-free. What's the difference? The difference is nuclear, which is emissions-free or counted as emissions-free, but not as renewable. Then the next one and the last one is 2050. For that, the goal is to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions to 15% of 99 levels, so that's now an 85% reduction. and then the ultimate goal, net zero. What does net zero refer to? There are offset mechanisms to greenhouse gas emissions. They could be carbon capture or forestations, and the act creates a mechanism of up to 15% of offsets, and offset mechanism for up to 15% of 99 levels. Importantly, though, that offset mechanism will not be available for the electricity sector. So if you follow the milestones, by 2040, 20 years from now, the electricity sector would have to be emissions-free without any regard to offset. Net zero, in the sense that offsets can't be used, is relevant for other sectors. So before I turn it over, just one more observation and a few numbers to put it all in context. So if we want to have 70% of electricity from renewable sources in 10 years, of course the question is, well, what is it now? And now it is about 27% of electricity comes from renewables, but of the 22 is from hydropower, mostly upstate, and that's considered an area that doesn't really offer opportunities for additional capacity. So if 22 of 27 is hydro, 5% is what most of us now think of renewable, which is solar and wind primarily. 5%, I'm sorry. So currently we are at 5% of renewables other than hydro. And that will have to go if you assume constant demand, and hydro remaining what it is. That would mean renewable has to go from 5%, renewables other than hydro, solar, wind, other new forms if possible, would have to go from 5% today to 48% of state electricity in 10 years. And that's the starting point for our discussion here. And the right person to start off with is Richard Miller, who is with a utility. Well, what do you make of those goals, particularly the short-term, relatively short-term goal, 2030? How are we going to get there? Will we get there? Are the goals to be taken seriously?
I'll answer the last question first, which is I think the goals have to be taken seriously because they're part of state law. And so, our company will certainly be taking these goals very seriously, and will certainly be working with the state and other stakeholders to help achieve these goals. In order to achieve this, just to kind of lay out for people, for our company, our position is, in general, we think that reliance on markets to achieve these goals, markets that include carbon pricing, would be the best way to achieve these goals in the most cost-effective manner, which is what the law also provides, that we should try and achieve these goals in the most cost-effective manner. And in fact, the law also provides for off-ramps if they think that the price of power, potential off-ramps, if they think the price of power is going to get too expensive. Now, where we think our company would play a particularly important role in helping to achieve these goals in the most cost-effective manner is to allow us to participate in the renewable power market. In 1998, when the New York State markets were first restructured to become more competitive and the markets were in their infancy, the state's position was that regulated utilities like Con Edison should not be allowed to participate in these markets. And that may have made sense 20 to 22 years ago. We think now the markets have matured to a very significant extent, that these goals are ambitious, and without every player being allowed to participate and compete in these markets, that it just makes it less likely that we're going to achieve these goals and achieve the goals in the most cost-effective manner. I will note in particular for Con Edison that we are now the second largest solar producer in the United States, seventh largest in the world. This is all outside of New York State because we are not allowed to participate in the New York State market, like I said, because of these market rules. So we're going to be working with everyone to achieve these goals. They're obviously very ambitious, and all we're asking at this point in time is that we be allowed to be a full participant in working to achieve the goals.
Just for clarification, a follow-up. So you're the second largest solar producer where? Not
In the
New York?
United States and seventh largest in the world.
In the United States,
Second-
not in the state of New York.
But we're not allowed to participate in New York State. And just to be clear, you know, when these rules were first adopted in 1998, we understood that competitive markets were in their infancy. We didn't have as ambitious clean energy goals back then. We did not contest the state's position that we should not be allowed to participate in these markets, but obviously things have changed a lot since then, and we think it's time to take a new look at this and look at us as a potential participant and competitor that can help the state to achieve its goals in the most cost-effective way.
Well, Maritza, what do you make of the 2030 goals?
It's definitely a tall order. I think you laid out, the numbers and how they would, the steep curve that adoption and regulations would need to sort of advance in order to, ensure that the market mechanisms that Rich mentioned are, position the state well and the competitors within the state to achieve that. Obviously strides have been made, and I think as a general matter, there's no reason to believe that the power sector is meaningfully going to be materially different from any other industry that is facing disruption and the impact of innovation. I think the question here more so is that it's such an intrinsic and ubiquitous challenge that spans a number of industries. So we're obviously talking about the power sector, but the goals that are articulated sort of extend, have implications for a broad set of industries. And as a result, I think become a much more complicated challenge to deal with and dealing with different market participants. I think one of the other issues is, to your point about the near-term goals, there is a mandate, but a number of the rules that will flesh out how the regulatory scheme work will only be put in fact, effectively, 5 years into the first 10 years of the mandate. And so I think that makes it fairly difficult for market participants to assess sort of how to compete effectively in the market so that they're well positioned to meet the mandate in 10 years and then ultimately in 20 years.
Richard Kaufman, until recently you were the energy czar. We suspect you had something to do with the creation of the Act. What is your perspective on particularly on the electricity goals, short term and 2040?
Well, I'm quite confident we're going to be able to achieve these goals. And I think it's important to understand a few things. One is we're not starting from stop. So the renewable energy deployment in the state, as you say, it's away from wind and solar, still modest. But if we look back 5 years ago, you wouldn't have been able really to measure it at all. So there's already been substantial progress in terms of solar and wind in the state. New York doesn't have the solar resources of the Southwest, but because of continued cost competitiveness of solar in the large-scale renewable solicitation, utility-scale solar is now competitive in New York State. The solar industry in New York State is one of the top solar states in the whole country. So that's the first point. The second point is not to quibble too much with the math. I think we feel like we're closer to 30% now than 27%. But beyond that, under contract, so again, the number we got to get to is 70% by 2030. So, again, we'd start at 30. 15%, another 15% is already under contract. So that leaves a hole of 25%. And there are active solicitations that are going on every year. So that's sort of the first couple of points. The other point I want to make is that the state has plenty of resources, not only onshore resources, but resources that can be delivered to the state from other places. That's one of the reasons why the Act, I think, is written the way that it is, doesn't permit offsets. It's because the state can't support itself, can have electricity delivered into the state that are clean. And the other thing that I'd point out is offshore wind. Again, if we had been talking about, had this a couple years ago, nobody would have been really talking about offshore wind. Offshore wind now is going to be a huge industry, and there's a commitment, the state has a commitment of 9,000 gigawatts, I mean, 9 gigawatts, 9,000 megawatts, by 2035, and we've already procured almost 1.7, and there'll be another solicitation this year of another 1,000 megawatts, so another gigawatt. So we have all that, and then the last point I'm going to make is that, of course, you can't just look at the electricity sector in terms of production, particularly when we talk about cost, without looking at energy efficiency and the utility business model. And so the question when we talk about cost competitiveness for all of this, we do have to look at the current structure of or the emerging changes in structure of the utility business model. And we can talk about that later, but I appreciate Con Ed's desire to get into competitive markets, but I think that we have work to do on Con Ed's continued evolution in its regulated business model in order to facilitate increasing numbers of renewables and to improve energy efficiency on a market-like basis.
Okay, thank you. We will turn back to some of the statements that were just made regarding
Because we were
the power
told that
sector.
we're supposed to be animated. Okay, so I'm following the order.
But we don't want to talk only about electricity because the greenhouse gas emissions goal really extends beyond the power sector. And I want to again start with some numbers that Richard has questioned, but they do come off the state government's website. So it's probably only that the website hasn't been updated yet. CO2 from fuel combustion, which accounts for 81% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and it's really the big part that needs to be addressed. So CO2 from fuel combustion in the state, 45% from transportation, 25% from residential uses, 22% from commercial, and 8% from industrial. So outside the power sector itself, if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and ultimately get to net zero by 2040, other changes need to happen. And that's where Elizabeth comes in. What do those targets mean for transportation and the use of natural gas outside the power sector?
Yeah, so I like that your numbers started with the transportation because at 45%, it's the single biggest chunk, and it's far, far bigger than the electric contribution to the CO2. It means that we basically need to be transitioning all of our vehicles to some form of zero emissions technology, which, I prefer not to prejudge what that is, but I do think that we know that electric will be a significant part of that. There are other options, or there may be other options. For example, hydrogen fuel cells, for example, would be another option. And there are, potentially biofuels can play a part. I would particularly caution, although it depends on their feedstock and, you know, what's going on upstream, whether they're really going to count as non-emitting. I think when we talk about alternative fuels, often we go straight to CNG. And I would like to specifically caution against our thinking about relying heavily on CNG vehicles because.
Can you help us?
I'm sorry, compressed natural gas.
We have it
Pardon
all
me.
no
Thank
acronyms
you.
without explanation,
I
so
apologize.
CNG.
Compressed natural gas. I'd like to specifically caution against that being a part of the solution for this particular problem. Because although they can contribute to significantly improved air quality impacts compared to, for example, diesel in some parts of the vehicle sector, some of the more recent data suggests that they may actually be worse from a greenhouse gas standpoint than conventional gasoline or diesel vehicles because of the methane loss. Once you start taking the methane seriously, once you count it on a 20-year horizon instead of a 100-year horizon in terms of its comparison to CO2, the risk of methane leakage associated with the compressed natural gas vehicles becomes a pretty serious detriment there, as far as our numbers suggest. So if you assume that a lot of the vehicles are going to go to electric, that means that you're going to need the infrastructure to support charging them. You're going to probably want to be optimizing the way you use their batteries, and I'm sure we'll at some point be touching on the need for storage to manage load, but you know, vehicles, they have batteries, they are charging batteries, and the way that you're charging the battery in the first place and potentially the way that you may draw down from the battery under certain circumstances, you know, electric vehicles potentially can be a resource to a grid that needs to adapt to a much challenging, higher and very challenging levels of intermittent renewables. A sort of medium-term opportunity might be specifically school buses, which sit still in a parking lot for the summer when, for now, our highest electric demand occurs, and they, you know, potentially can operate together as a significant battery resource. So it's not all a challenge. You know, to some extent, this electrification of the vehicle fleets is an opportunity that needs to be undertaken in tandem with the transformation of the electric system. At least for a bunch of the vehicle categories, including light duty, but also including, you know, even transit buses are on track to become cost competitive up front against their conventional diesel counterparts, which means that after the date at which they become at parity, then you'll be paying a premium for your internal combustion engine. And what's going to hold you back at that point from wanting to go all electric? It's going to be the infrastructure. So, you know, to start bringing this transport sector, drawing down the carbon from this sector means actually needing to build up a whole bunch of infrastructure on the electric side, and thinking about the business arrangements by which the vehicles that are actually plugging into it are interacting with it. And as for natural gas, I brought numbers also. And so I'm going to look at my sheet. So I ran some numbers based on, I think, the 2018 state greenhouse gas inventory. So it was 2015 numbers because it lags a little bit. I haven't had a chance to rerun them with the 2019 greenhouse gas inventory, but it should be close. And what I found when I ran these numbers a while ago is that back in 1990, the tonnage of CO2 attributable specifically to natural gas, one way or another, was about 52, I guess it's million metric tons. And that was in 1990. It's up significantly since then, and that was 24.6% of the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to energy and 21.8% of the economy-wide. And then in the ensuing 20 years, or actually these numbers go through 2015, 25 years. In the ensuing 25 years, the share of natural gas has actually gone up in several sectors. The tonnage of natural gas has gone up. So as of 2015, the number was, let me see if I can, it was 76.4. And the number that I'd like to keep an eye on is what was the target for much of this time. So now we have a 100% or 85% reduction in greenhouse gases that we're trying to achieve. But for a long time, we were trying to achieve 80%. And 80% reductions compared to 1990 total would mean that our carbon budget in 2050 would have been 47.7 million metric tons for the whole economy. And we were already having more emissions in natural gas than that budget back in 1990, and it's gone up by, on the order of 50%. So it's, it together with everything else needs to go down just to get to that 80 by 50, and to get even further than that needs to go down, a good deal further. And that's, I think, without taking into account the farther upstream leakage and without weighting methane, again, on the 20-year horizon. And I keep mentioning the methane 20-year horizon. That's a matter of law now in the CLCPA, that methane gets compared to, or all the short-term pollutants get compared to carbon on a 20-year horizon rather than the 100-year. So natural gas is looking like a pretty tremendous challenge to get to 2050.
Well, thank you. Another sector, mentioned before, of course, is buildings, commercial buildings and residential buildings. I would think probably everybody in the room here burns natural gas in some form, because either the building has heating or through natural gas. Some buildings in New York still have oil. And in any event, you probably have a natural gas stove in your kitchen. So then, what are they going to do?
That's an easy question to start with. Thank you. Vornado owns and manages about 25 million square feet of office and retail space in New York City, and we represent the end user of the energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas, or in our case, district steam, which is a large part of our energy portfolio. And so, thinking about CLCPA, we've charged ourselves with understanding what we can do within the confines of our building, whether it's retrofitting the landlord's equipment, fuel switching, whether it's talking to our tenants who control most of the energy in the space. We're tackling the path to net zero by absolutely prioritizing energy efficiency and learning how to do more with less energy. So the CLCPA is actually quite complementary to that, in that it addresses the issues outside the building, upstream from the building. Thinking about the state of New York, there are some certain advantages to undertaking a goal here, particularly in that the ISO shares a geopolitical border with the state itself. So when it comes to planning for the renewables in the state, you're not crossing, you can cross many boundaries, but when it comes to planning the electricity supply, that can largely fall within the responsibility of state policymakers. That being said, I think what is really critical to the success of this will also be transmission improvements. So you have a state that has a significantly different composition of electricity supply upstate versus down. You have a city here who's relying heavily on 2 fossil fuel-driven plants in Queens. You have an elevated conscience about the public health implications of combusting fossil fuel and sort of the localized detriments to vulnerable populations that goes along with that. And you have a business community here in New York City, that wants to make sure that the benefits of having renewable power are realized in more ways than one locally. So, we're very much interested in having a narrative for our tenants, for our investors, for our employees that says, not only is our electricity coming from a renewable place, but it has localized benefit and contributes significantly to the state's goals.
Well, so transmission improvement is probably a good segue back to Richard. Richard Kaufman. Richard, you almost, asked your next question already in your opening statement about changes in the utility sector. Maybe you can elaborate what you mean, and also maybe specifically respond to the other Richard's point. Can Con Ed participate in renewable, and if not, why not?
Okay, well, can we also talk a little bit about transportation?
We can talk
Okay.
about everything.
All right. So, just a couple of comments on transportation. So obviously, that's the biggest part of the problem and challenging. So, the good news, I think, is the fact that storage costs continue to decline, not just for cars, but there's what's in terms of storage on the grid, and what's good for the goose can be good for the gander here. And so just in terms of storage and the point about storage on the grid and the possibility for vehicle-to-grid storage, all this stuff in terms of storage on the grid. And again, just to give you confidence about the value of intentionality in government policy, because before the Climate Act was passed, there were mandates related to storage at the time that seemed very aggressive. And I have those down here. So that was going to be 3 gigawatts by 2030, a gigawatt and a half by 2025. And just so you know, right now in the queue for the wholesale market, and that's the ISO that Dan talked about, that's the independent system operator, there are 6 gigawatts already in the queue. Now, not all that's going to wind up actually happening, but it gives you a sense about storage developers and storage technology and the potential for storage, including the ability to shut down some polluting peaker plants. Those can be the most polluting plants around that are in the downstate area. So Dan, when you talk about environmental benefits, this is going to be a clear example of storage, and that's coming very near term. The other thing that is challenging in the transportation sector relative to the electricity sector is what authorities we have as a state. Now, we have shared authorities with the federal government in the electricity sector. The federal government controls wholesale markets while the state controls retail markets, but we have quite a lot of authority. When it comes to the auto sector, we have much less authority. So, or a question of how much authority we have when you consider that the federal government is challenging fuel efficiency standards in California. And so if you saw the Super Bowl yesterday, you got a flavor of how much the auto industry is investing in electric vehicles. And so if you talk to any auto parts supplier or any manufacturer, this is not just a joke. I mean, they're really putting real dollars behind it. But the question is going to be, is the United States going to try to resist those macro trends, or whether it's going to, from a federal policy standpoint, help accelerate the trends towards electrification. The state may have very little influence over that. So that does take me to this point about the transmission and sort of the grid and all this, because in order to because we have to do this on a cost-effective and quickly, all of this, and this electrification transportation, if that's going to be a significant part of the solution, is going to require a different kind of grid, because it's going to require, as Elizabeth said, more intermittency, more storage, and that means a different business model for the utilities, because the utilities in the past have had a business model which relies upon deployment of capital and getting paid for the deployment of capital. But it does mean that we have a system which is very capital inefficient relative to other capital-intensive industries. So we have an average capacity utilization of the grid, including transmission and including generation, that's about 50%. And other capital-intensive industries that you know of, every single other one that you know of, leading sectors in the rest of the economy are 80 to 90%. And that's been a result of adoption of new technology, changes in business model, and changes in financial incentives. And so if we're going to be able to do this on a cost-effective basis, we're going to have a grid which is much more dynamic, where supply and demand is dynamic, right, as opposed to being based upon everything being built for the peak hours and days of the year. And so that's why when we think about electric transportation and all of this other stuff, we have to look at the whole picture systemically, and that's why when we talk about I'll stop at this point. When we talk about transmission, yes, we're going to need more transmission, but we can't have transmission. There are transmission lines in the state that currently have average capacity utilization of 35%. So just to build more transmission, which has 35% average capacity utilization, is really going to be expensive. We have to figure out how to get more out of the infrastructure that we already have before we start building a lot of new stuff.
Well, Richard, do you agree or disagree with Richard?
So I'd just like to say two quick things up front. One is on the 50% capital utilization for our system, which is, relatively typical. We might be a little bit better than other places just because of high-intensity energy usage in New York City. The company has long been aware of the need to try and smooth out demand on its system as much as possible. We've always been a national leader in terms of implementing demand response programs. And probably right now we're in the middle of our most important technological initiative, which is our AMI automated meter initiative, which the goal of that, and Environmental Defense Fund is a big supporter of that, is to give more control to customers over their energy usage, more real-time energy information, so that they will be able to smooth out their demand on the system, which will enable us to increase utilization and help to alleviate that problem. Not clear it will ever be able to go completely away, but we are taking steps to make that issue less of an issue than it has been in the past and to improve system utilization. The second thing, just to be clear, I do think that, and Richard has been part of this, one of the most important changes in state policy that has occurred over the last 5 years is the fact that we are now able to capitalize our energy efficiency spending, which means that we are able to earn money on it, and we have the proper economic incentive to pursue energy efficiency just as much as we pursue capital additions. So I think, both those things are just important for people to be aware of, that while the past, what people looked at as the past utility business model, which was that we only earned money by putting wire in the ground, that is actually not true anymore. We earn money by pursuing and implementing energy efficiency programs successfully, and we actually strongly appreciate that change in state policy. Now, on the issue of transmission, I think, Richard, and we all know that while we can improve system utilization to a significant extent, that in order to really fully accommodate the state's renewable goals, we are going to have to increase the amount of transmission in the state. The exact amount of it is something for the experts to debate in the fora, in the various places where they debate it. The New York Independent System Operator is one of them, and it goes down to a level of technological speak and dispatch talk that I'm sure nobody in this audience wants us to go into tonight, but let it just be said simply that the state does need more transmission, and the amount of it is still to be determined.
Yes, of course.
So I've come across as being confrontational to Con Ed, and I haven't really meant to do that, because I would say that there are a number of utilities in the state, and I would point to Con Ed as having been very helpful and supportive of state policy. I think that however, I think all of us have to do more. So when you talk about demand response as an example, demand response is not a business for Con Ed. It is a matter of regulatory compliance. And when we talk about in general, because this is we have problems in New York, and we have obviously global problems when we talk about trying to deal with climate change. This question of the utility business model is a global issue, and demand response is, as I say, not a business. It's something that is a very helpful program, but is not inherently building a very dynamic grid. And it is not a business. It's just something utilities have to do. And the other point I just wanted to make, kind of going back to offshore wind, the challenge in New York State is that 2/3 of the renewables, actually 2/3 of generation in New York State is what we might consider upstate, with only 1/3 of the demand being upstate. And so that's a real challenge when we think about increasing, a lot of the renewable resources are upstate that are onshore. And so that's what causes this issue of the need for more transmission. As I said, we're going to need more transmission because we're going to need all the renewable resources we can get. But the reason I talked about the benefit of offshore wind is that offshore wind is close to New York City and the bulk of the load in the state. And so it's a lot easier to build transmission from there than it is hundreds of miles from upstate. And I talked about that 9,000 megawatt goal by 2030, of which 1.7 is already contracted for. That 9 gigawatt number represents 1/3 of the power in New York State. So these are big numbers that are coming, and it goes a long way to alleviating the need to build a lot more upstate transmission.
Well, so when I listen to the two of you, it seems like we are on track. Yes, the goals are ambitious, the statutory goals, but the trend is pointing to them, to achieving them, and the utilities, if I'm listening to Richard Miller, the utilities are responding, so everything is good. Do you, the three of you, would you agree, or do you see it differently? Maybe Elizabeth or Maritza, whoever wants to.
I don't think that's a fair characterization so far.
So, without opining on whether that was a fair characterization, I think that the things that I'm not necessarily hearing yet, and that I think are going to be the big complicating factors that I haven't necessarily alluded to yet, or that I have, but the numbers that we've been talking about in terms of the renewables are still based on constant demand. And so if we assume that various things are going to electrify, that's probably not constant demand. Exactly how much of an impact on demand, which is specifically peak usage, that can depend on how it's rolled out and how much efficiency there is and how much controllable load there is and how dynamic pricing is. Is it a few demand response events, or is it users throughout the system having a chance to respond to wholesale prices? So there's that. And the other big transformation, I think, that's really in its infancy, I think it's a few years behind some of the other utility business model work, is the changes to the gas utility business model that need to be happening in parallel with the changes to the electric utility business model. When there's a lot of discussions about utility business models that never mention anything other than electric. And it's starting. It's definitely starting, but that system can be dynamic too. And this amazing AMI rollout that you mentioned includes actually gas AMI. So how exactly is...
MAI.
I'm sorry, see, here I go. I'm so sorry. Advanced metering infrastructure, smart meters.
How apparent.
Which are, I'm so sorry. So there are electric advanced meters, and there are modules, I guess, that modify ordinary gas meters.
Correct.
that give them some advanced functionality. My understanding is that they measure in rather larger increments than the electric ones, but there's some opportunity to start having gas usage be flexible also. And we're starting to see experimentation with gas demand response, for example, and we're starting to see non-pipeline alternatives maybe going down a similar road to non-wires alternatives, which is not an acronym, but it is something we haven't discussed yet. So the use of basically anything other than the grid or equivalent pipe infrastructure solutions. So in a situation where the paradigmatic one in New York, the sort of mother of them all, is the one that happened at the Brooklyn-Queens border, when a more than $1 billion substation was needed. And so far, we've managed to hold it, Con Ed has managed to hold it off largely with efficiency. So that's this giant efficiency success.
It's actually a mixture of efficiency and demand response.
Yes.
But
Yes. But basically, the idea that when you have what seems to be a need, do you really have a need to build something, or do you actually just have more demand than you really need to have? And that you can manage either of those. Or is there some third option that, is there an on-site generation that would meet the need of some kind, including renewables? So but in the non-wires context, there are starting to be ways that a utility like Con Ed can be compensated. They can be compensated for building the wires, but they also actually have ways of being compensated for avoiding the wires, which is kind of a paradigm shift. And we're starting to see efforts to move the gas system in a similar direction. But that's much earlier and needs.
Maritza, any comments on my unfair characterization?
Again, won't take the position as to whether it's fair or unfair. I mean, I think one of the resounding sort of comments or generally, the statements is around, on one end of the equation, there's a question about cost and the extent to which innovation is going to drive down cost over time. And we see that, across the various industries and sectors that are involved. And I think the other side of the equation, speaking, as a deal lawyer, representing investors, is to what extent is there clarity on what the market mechanisms are going to be for different players, such that it influences behavior and investment strategy sufficiently far out, mindful that a number of the investments have to be planned now in order to achieve, commercial operation 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. And so one of the challenges, whether we're talking about battery storage or other technologies, is thinking about not just the cost side of the equation, but on the revenue side, to what extent are some of the new resources and technologies that would be coming online, how they would be compensated in the market, and how they will participate in the market, and those rules are yet to be set. So there's a little bit of the chicken and egg problem from the perspective of the investor, and how you encourage that, that level of engagement, absent subsidies, and just having, the market as a driver of growth and innovation.
Dan?
Sure. I would, just adding on the demand response part of the conversation, I think that buildings themselves need to be part of the discussion on how they can be dynamic and be part of the solution to using energy not only more efficiently in that you're using less of it, but also you're using it at the right time so that you can have this sort of dynamically responding supply and demand pattern. Demand response is lucrative for end users as well, for building owners. But the process of readying an asset for demand response also, by nature of automation of your systems, of being able to respond to a market signal, prepares the building itself to participate more meaningfully in future needs. So it could be ongoing demand management, it could be working on-site storage into the solution. I think that as we plan for additional demand to come onto the grid, I completely agree that the solution can't be just to give the grid more juice. I think it needs to be used more efficiently, and buildings are sitting right out here, ready as a resource to participate as well. And then just with the state goals, I think what would be very helpful is to see what from these goals, what are the incremental key performance indicators going to be? What are the signals that we should be looking for to understand that the goals are advancing, that they're happening? Whether it's a grid intensity metric, measuring the carbon output, or just understanding, the pipelined renewable projects versus the permitted versus the completed, I think helps us, feel better about the advancement of these projects and understanding that the dial is in fact moving on reliance on fossil fuel. I think we have a society and an industry whose awareness is elevating, and they're going to be looking for sort of a measuring stick to understand that these goals are actually happening and that progress is being made.
Can
Yes.
get in on this. So I think one of the key questions in all this is how much are we going to get to where we want to get to through mandates versus market mechanisms? And so I think some people are aware of the duck curve in California, solar, and we've had the benefit of being a little later than some of the other places like California. And so we had the benefit in thinking about policy to observe, well, why does California have a duck curve? And the reason that they have a duck curve is that their solar policy was a mandate, and it was bolted on to a grid architecture that was designed by George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla that was never designed for solar. And so that's why we keep talking about, and Dan just talked about this more dynamic grid. That's the kind of grid we need to build, which is a grid which is not kind of the mainframe equivalent, but kind of the equivalent of the IT system today, which is a mix of still large power plants, but distributed solutions where supply and demand is dynamic, which has a lot of IT on it, by the way, as well. And I think our perspective from a policy standpoint is just in the same way that we rebuilt the telephony system in the United States and we rebuilt the IT system in the United States. Government didn't say, oh, this is the number of switches or the number of modems. It created some broad policy objectives and market mechanisms and let the market figure out how to allocate capital and figure out the right solutions. Because when you have a storage mandate, for example, alone, how do you know that the right answer is storage as opposed to electricity storage as opposed to ice storage? Or how do you know the answer isn't a non-wire solution that involves energy efficiency or some other software solution? So our approach in the state has been to have mandates, but generally have mandates that follow what we believe we're doing to establish the right market mechanisms, so the mandates follow the market as opposed to the markets driving. I mean, the mandates driving the markets. Because when you have the markets, you have the mandates driving the market, what it means is that you have a bunch of solar people that want to go after the solar mandate, and the storage people that want to go after the storage mandate, but it does not build the grid that we need to build. And so, and I'll stop here. The point about the energy efficiency is clearly a key part, but a huge part of the answer. But energy efficiency, we have to figure out how we're going to get the energy efficiency in the context of market-related mechanisms as opposed to mandate-related mechanisms.
So, yes, Richard. Sorry.
Yeah, if I can just make two quick comments about this. Yeah, I think if people look at our most recent Con Edison, rate case that we filed, you'll see we had a lot of money in there for grid modernization, and actually we are now going to be implementing to a greater degree what many people say needs to be the grid of the future, which is the two-way grid where we both supply to customers and customers supply back to us. And then I'm sorry, but I just have to throw that little bit of utility caution in here because I did hear the line about utility IT spending and, for information technology, our last rate case does include a very significant piece of information technology spending, and we now talk about that as being a fourth branch of our company. But for utilities, and I think everyone understands this, you cannot talk about information technology without talking about cyber risk. And so, as we move forward on grid innovation and grid modernization, cybersecurity will always be foremost in mind for this company.
Any responses? Let me try another question. So several of you have used terms like demand management, efficiency, including when it comes to natural gas. But net zero ultimately means a complete elimination of oil and natural gas. And so efficiency then is really just another bridge. And how are we going to get to a complete elimination of oil and natural gas in New York within the prescribed time frame?
I have a partial response. So on the electric.
Dan will provide the other part.
On the electric side, efficiency is more than a bridge, because efficiency is one of the determinants of how much generation you're actually going to need. And so the less generation you need, the less load you have in the first place, the less generation you're going to need to build. So electric efficiency kind of needs to be part of the puzzle all the way through to the very end. On the natural gas side, it is more complicated. Some natural gas efficiency spending, in theory, could actually be detrimental if it's extending, basically pouring money into something that's going to become a stranded cost, which is, a cost that where the infrastructure has been put in place and now there's no good basis to recover it because it's not going to be used. There are starting to be technological replacements for what have traditionally been natural gas applications. There's also potentially fuels that could go through those pipes that might actually make sense over an indefinite term. Depending again on what your carbon accounting really looks like. You have to make sure that you're not actually letting a whole bunch of methane out in the process, because then even if it was lovely biologically originated methane, you're still going to wind up with a terrible greenhouse gas problem. But it's conceivable that parts of the natural gas system have a long-term utility, carrying something other than fossil gas.
Dan?
So you asked for the rest of that?
Yeah,
answer?
yes. Yeah, how are we going to, will we eliminate oil and gas, natural gas completely from the state?
Without being the scientist at the table or even close to it, I think that we are relying on innovation. So, we have existing buildings, not just our company, but this whole city has buildings that were designed, during an era that had a much different social conscientiousness about energy. Most likely carbon emissions weren't part of the discussion at all. We are wedded to an existing infrastructure that is going to take time and creativity to undo, I guess. I do think that there are, we shouldn't discount bridge solutions that are becoming more readily available in the shorter term. I think, the public dialogue right now about fossil fuels completely appreciate the urgency of having to, slow our and reverse, quite honestly, our impact on the climate. And fossil fuels are an enormous piece of that conversation. But to have a plan and a goal in place, it's going to take incremental steps in order to ultimately get there. So I'm not being terribly specific because I think there's going to be a different, on the real estate lens, it's a different solution for each building. I think there's better opportunities for new construction right now than there is for existing buildings. And I do think that the existence of mandates and bold pieces of legislation will create markets that will innovate and bring products to customers that will ultimately get us there.
Can I?
Yeah, of course.
So Elizabeth talked about hydrogen. So the current means of producing hydrogen, and we use hydrogen in industrial purposes. So hydrogen is a really good fuel, very useful molecule. The current technology for producing hydrogen comes from natural gas reforming. So it actually uses natural gas, so it's not it's not very good from an environmental standpoint. There's another technology which is more expensive, where the hydrogen comes from putting a current through water. And so there's a lot of work that's going on in renewably produced hydrogen. And of course, as renewable costs come down, because one of the biggest costs of that process is electricity. So as renewable costs come down, the cost of producing hydrogen from water is cheaper. So when we talk about innovation, I don't want you to think that this is necessarily decades and decades from now. That's the first point. The second thing that's going on now, it's still early, but it's going on now, is a lot of work on and companies that are actually making stuff capturing CO2 from the air, which is very cool since we have a CO2 problem. Let's get it, let's attack a CO2 problem. So there are companies that are embedding CO2 in concrete today as a business. And so this gives rise to, I think, because it's to Dan's point about the relationship between mandates and markets. The benefit of a mandate is it drives capital formation and all kinds of people interested in going after that market. And so we can imagine a series of policies that would take place as we did with the development of the offshore wind industry, where we gradually have, for example, a clean concrete standard in the state. So it doesn't cost very much because it's a small standard initially, but increases over time. That gives a line of sight to developers to invest in the business. We could imagine a clean fuel standard. California has a clean fuel standards because if you can capture hydrogen from a renewable standpoint and you can capture CO2 from the air, it's not a big deal to create some, renewable hydrocarbons. So we could imagine that eventually being the case. We could imagine having hydrogen that's produced from renewable sources beginning to be injected into the natural gas infrastructure. And so have essentially a renewable hydrogen standard, the same kind of point, over time increasing. And then the last point about this is that we talk about New York as a single state. The benefit that we've had, again, talking about offshore wind, is that we have other states around us that have also realized that by establishing markets that are bigger than just New York, we can really drive down costs. So the offshore wind solicitations, because it's now not just a 9 gigawatt market, it's a 30 gigawatt market. The solicitations that we got from wind in terms of cost were 40% less than we thought when we did the analysis 2 years ago. So that's why I think we could really imagine the next wave of policies being in this area of alternative fuels and alternative things that could become much bigger much sooner, and that will solve this last bit of the puzzle.
You all have, for about an hour now, been very successful in avoiding the word nuclear. Technology changes, and so has nuclear technology. Is there any room for nuclear energy in New York's future? Maybe Richard M.
If I can defer, Richard Kaufman, I don't know. I kind of feel like that's more of a state policy issue, even though it's federal siting.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I'll just say quickly is that to the extent that we do get an electricity market that incorporates carbon pricing, it will obviously create more of an economic advantage for nuclear, whether in the current environment that means that nuclear will have enough of an economic advantage to actually be the new resource to be built, I think is still a significant question and still a very significant siting concern where the state has a very significant role to play, even though ultimately the feds make the decision.
Yeah, and, sorry.
No, please.
I think, to echo the comments that Rich just made, I think it's one area particularly where there is, and electric vehicles being the other, where there's, mismatch and sort of a regulatory overlap in the various jurisdictions. So you have sort of federal oversight of both the questions around how you manage nuclear, how, broader concerns, including impacting sort of national security, and your point about sort of cyber attacks and how that's all going to be construed in a broader framework on the one hand, and sort of state incentives and interest in the siting of and deployment of sort of technologies that are going to be sort of carbon-free.
So if I could add a couple things about nuclear. So I think for people who may not be aware, but the governor was committed to closing Indian Point. So Indian Point has 2 units that are currently operating. One is going to shut down in April, and the other is going to shut down a year from April. But there are other nuclear plants in the state that the governor, and the reason the governor wanted to shut down Indian Point is because it's on a fault and there's no reasonable evacuation plan. There's no evacuation plan for Indian Point. It would never be permitted today to be built. But there are other nuclear plants that are upstate that supply about, I don't know, 15% of electricity?
19.7?
Well, 19, that's the total, I
Yeah.
think. So, and so we have a lot of nuclear in the state, and so the governor helped lead a policy in the absence of a federal cost of carbon, a program which pays those plants the environmental benefits of zero carbon. So it's a zero emissions credit, a contract that those plants have received. And that lasts until, I guess, around 2030.
2029.
2029, okay. So, so the other point I would make is that we are going to be hearing more about nuclear power, both from a climate change standpoint, but also because in spite of the fact that there's only been one nuclear power plant that's still being built in the United States with enormous cost overruns in Georgia, there are what are called small modular reactors that are in development and will be deployed. I don't know exactly where. There'll be one at least deployed in the United States within the next 5 years. And so the benefit of the small nuclear reactors is that they can get scale manufacturing economics as opposed to the way things are built now, which have enormous cost overruns. So we'll have to see what those costs will be for those kind of plants. We'll have to see whether the federal government will ever come up with a reasonable place for storage. Europe has come up with a place for storage that will change the nuclear industry in Europe. So it's another example where the United States may be out of step with the rest of the world and how it thinks about this next generation of nuclear plants.
I think it's a good time to open this for some audience questions, please. Do we have a mic, Danielle? How are we doing it?
I think just
Yeah.
loudly.
There's a nuclear question that's coming.
A question for you, sir, Professor. When you started off, you very nicely gave us quite a few days to remember the mandates and their goals. I'd like to add one more day to that. I'd like to add the year 2040. What's so special about 2040? By 2040, we going to have all this 9,000 megawatts of offshore power, and you can very easily look at the construction schedule and calculate how many metric tons of carbon dioxide that wonderful system is going to save us. On the other hand, going back to Mr. Kaufman's discussion of Indian Point, you can also calculate, since Indian Point appears to be replaced by gas, how much greenhouse gases. So my colleagues and I have done that, and here's the wonderful savings from the offshore. Here's the wonderful lost greenhouse gases being added continuously, and they intersect at 2040. In other words, there is no net benefit to the offshore wind power system, which I greatly support, until 2040. This seems to be a gross error. And frankly, Mr. Kaufman, I'd be glad to discuss with you this business about emergency planning and also about the seismic stuff. Just remember, in Japan, when this magnitude 9 earthquake occurred, starting with Fukushima, none of the containment buildings in Japan failed. None. Thank you.
Was there a question embedded?
Yeah. What are you going to do about that? What
It's Robert's question.
Net CO2. There is no net CO2 from the offshore power if you simultaneously let Indian Point be converted to gas. Gas is a huge mistake. And if the basis of that is incorrect, which a number of us nuclear nerds are convinced it's incorrect, then the state is making an enormous blunder.
Does it? I think it
Well,
was
the
you
man-
were
the-
mostly on the
the-
receiving end.
It's a closed system. The mandate is the mandate, right? So you're raising really more of a cost issue than a carbon issue.
No, this is a carbon issue. I want to see us succeed in climate change. New York says it is a climate leader. The climate leadership of New York is going to end on May 1st of this year. May 1st is the first day that gas will begin to replace Indian Point. At 7 million metric tons of CO2 every year. And I haven't added in what Mr. Stein said, the upstream methane. If you just, it's a very simple arithmetic. You add up all the savings offshore, we've done that. You add up all the CO2 coming from the replacements, the gas replacements, and they intersect around 2040. Well, that's too late. I don't want to wait until 2040 to have a net benefit out of the offshore stuff. I want it as quickly as they can build it. But when the left hand is doing one thing and the right hand is doing something else, and they cancel each other, that's not good policy.
Well, I'm just going to say this. Look, the governor made this decision. You know, the nature, what government has to do is to protect its people. That's its first objective. And the governor made a judgment about safety and the safety with respect to Indian Point. You may disagree with his judgment, but that was the judgment that he made.
No, I'm sorry, sir. The governor, and I've read the stuff, on January 2017 said that Indian Point would be replaced by non-emission sources. And if it's replaced by gas, that is an emission source. So you can't have it both ways.
All right, this last point, okay, Indian Point was going to shut down anyway, and I think we should go back to Maritz's point about markets and market structure and how economics are going to be. The operator was going to shut down Indian Point anyway because the economics of that plant weren't working. What the governor did in negotiating a more orderly transition was to permit whatever market resources were coming into play, and there have been some renewable resources. I don't know exactly what all the resources will eventually be to support that plant, but certainly renewable resources are going to be used to replace Indian Point.
Well, let me try to, rephrase this in maybe a little bit in different terms. So Indian Point is getting shut down, and I've, of course, no basis to question that, that there are security concerns, but of course, it's also closer to New York City. And so the energy policy of the state seems to be very much driven from a New York City perspective, yet it is New York City that is a much bigger consumer of natural gas, including natural gas that comes from fracking in Pennsylvania, while upstate New York, which could frack, is not allowed to do so. So what do you all think about the dichotomy between upstate and the New York metropolitan area when it comes to setting energy policy goals for the state?
I will just add that to the extent that, and I know this is still a question, to what degree we're going to rely on offshore wind and upstate wind to meet our renewable goals, but clearly upstate wind is an economic development strategy for upstate New York, and so to the extent that the state is moving in that direction, it is a benefit to upstate. It will benefit from the state's policies. Now, as Richard, I think, has already mentioned, there's still a question as to how much will be offshore wind off of Long Island and how much upstate, but I think we all think that there will be some amount of upstate wind that is going to be necessary to meet the state's energy policy goals.
We're going to need all the renewables we can get.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, just a small thing to add, and this may be actually what you're going to get at, so if I preempt, I apologize. The New York City perspective has its own climate mandate, and where the largest buildings, not necessarily all that large, 25,000 square feet or more, are required to achieve some pretty deep greenhouse gas reduction, and their ability to do so depends partly on the carbon intensity of the electric mix that's actually available to users downstate. So a sort of secondary effect of that is that it pushes us in the direction of needing to develop more renewables that are down here in the downstate load pocket, the part of the state where the load exceeds the ability to deliver energy from outside.
Yeah, I was trying to go pretty far into this event without mentioning the Climate Mobilization
There
Act.
we are.
But, so it's a great point, and I think that the city policy, the CMA, has created new interests and a new private market in investing in renewables, to the extent that those opportunities to invest will contribute towards compliance with the city law. And so at present, the city law, permits an alternate compliance route for meeting your carbon emissions cap as offsetting up to 100% of your electricity with a renewable energy credit. However, the source of that renewable energy must somehow be located either inside Zone J, which is essentially the 5 boroughs of New York, or sink directly into Zone J. And at present, at scale, there are no opportunities for that. So to add another layer of sort of interesting market dynamics to this conversation, you have now the real estate, owners in New York City with an interest in understanding how more renewable power is in fact going to make its way into the 5 boroughs to assist with compliance with the Climate Mobilization Act, whose penalties could be quite punitive. And so it'll be interesting to see how perhaps the two policies can be harmonized a little bit so that you're actually addressing a true market need down in the city that also helps further a critical component of CLCPA.
Let's invite additional questions. Yes, please.
We have a microphone now.
We do. Okay, so first there and then you, sir. Let the lady go first and then you.
Hi there. I have a transportation-related question. When we're looking at electrifying our vehicle fleet, that's going to be something that's going to achieve carbon emissions going forward. However, as we discussed in the panel, that's going to have some impacts on grid planning in the future. The add-on question I have to that is, how do we get people looking at transit as well as alternative transportation, such as walking and bicycling? And that's one thing to do here in a city that already exists with a certain amount of density, but other communities, say, in other parts of the state, what are some policy interventions and what are some behavioral changes? How do we influence that so we can really drive down carbon emissions in the transportation sector?
I don't know if anyone on the panel is actually a transportation advocate. I'm sorry to say that I'm actually not well versed in the particular problem you have posed, even though I am with you on this. Here in the city, the congestion pricing that we hope to see launched is being launched largely to improve the subway system, which has gotten into such terrible disrepair, and also to improve the quality of bus service and to electrify the bus service. So I think that possibly the better opportunity in a lot of other places is bus rather than trains. And that the more recently, I would hope that the recent assertions about trying to electrify transit fleets statewide would come in tandem with some general modernization of those bus fleets, and that could help attract more people to buses. But I'm really outside my comfort zone here.
I'll just add real quickly, as someone who works near 14th Street, the 14th Street busway is a phenomenal step forward in terms of advancing mass transportation in New York City, and we'll see the degree to which our public and our politicians are willing to continue to implement those kinds of changes to our streetscape.
I'm the moderator here, but I will add a personal statement as well. It would really help if police officers stopped parking their private cars in the bus lane on 2nd Avenue. Okay, question here.
Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors, and NYU Tandon. You all spoke about the necessity for more renewables, but at the same time, you spoke about the increase in natural gas. What I'd like to hear from you is if you indeed want to promote renewables and disincentive given to natural gas and fossil fuels, what are the specific carbon price levels that you're talking about for 2030 and 2040? And if the numbers are anything close to what exists today in California, or even around here at $15 a ton, we're all whistling Dixie. So number one, is it a high number, and does it start with a 3 or a 4 at least, going up from there? And number two, that's going to attack not just the alternative power plant fuels, but also the transportation problem, because as we know, more and more I see CNG buses around cities, including New York, instead of electric mass transit buses. And in the very least, this institution should have its own electric NYU bus going around the campuses. And if you're increasing the local cogeneration power plant with more natural gas because you're building another building, why? Why not solar? Why not something like what is being done, for example, on top of the Bopst Library right now, which is some solar panels? Why not put it in the new building that is being finished now, the coal replacement building on Mercer, as opposed to increasing natural gas load here, 2 blocks away, underground, as you all know, the cogeneration natural gas power plant? Thank you.
Who wants to take this?
So at least in the short run, can I just say I still think cogeneration is an option out there. I mean, you know, one thing you can debate a lot is short run versus long run, but cogeneration is still a very efficient way, as you know, to produce both electricity and heating. And I think most people, from an environmental perspective, still have a positive view of the Con Edison steam system. You know, what its long-term viability will be in light of all these other environmental goals is a significant question. But I think for the short run, at least, people view that. As for carbon price, you know, I'm not gonna, I'll let somebody else try and speculate about what, you know, numbers are necessary, but just, you know, following up on short run versus long run, I think long run still matters, right? Even if you're not seeing anything in the short run from a carbon price, it does still send a very important long run price signal. Now, some might say we don't have the long run, you know, we can't wait for whatever the long run might be, but, you know, and I can hear them on that, but I'll just say right now that, you know, at least it does set that long run price signal.
You can't set the goals for market share until you have a price signal that says this is the carbon price.
Well, obviously, this is why some policymakers want to use mandates in addition to carbon pricing.
Richard?
Well, you know, this is really one of these challenges when we talk about state policy in light of the absence of federal policy, right? So we must have a market price of carbon as not the only answer, but as a key policy instrument, no question about that. So the state has different ways in which it pays for the environmental attributes of renewables. That's how we support renewables. We pay for the renewable energy attributes, both, again, the environmental attributes. We have a RGGI system, we're part of Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which, of course, as you know, has a low price of carbon. But it's very difficult for a state to do its own thing in terms of an economy-wide cost of carbon when we're part of a regional and national economy. So it's very difficult for a state to do this on its own. And you can shake your head, but it's, you know, but it's unfortunately true. None of this is easy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, you know, the ways to get, you know, we don't really, as Richard was saying, we don't really have a clear way of going with an economy-wide price, which is, of course, the gold standard and the right thing to do. I am familiar, I've gathered from my colleagues in California where they have a low carbon fuel standard that in certain respects, the way it's implemented kind of yields sort of almost a shadow carbon price in certain respects. A fleet that's the way it works in California, I'm not taking a position on LCFS in New York, but the way it works in California, apparently fleets that are overperforming, fleets that are, have way less emissions than they're permitted to have under the low carbon fuel standard, for example, electric fleets, are able to sell their overcompliance to fleets that are underperforming on a per ton basis. And that per ton basis apparently can sell for as much as $100 a ton. And that winds up being funds that the parties that have these electric fleets are able to pour into more charging infrastructure and more electrification of their vehicles. So, there's, do we have a clear pathway to an economy-wide price? No, but, there may be opportunities to produce the effect of a price in various different sectors.
You want to permit one more question?
Sure. Thank you. I'm Len Rodberg, formerly Queens College. What I hear from the panel is that the state's plan for getting off of fossil fuels is basically, aside from the offshore wind, is basically solar, and not nuclear. If I look at the state's energy plan, it's solar and wind. If I look at NYSERDA's research program, it's solar and wind. There's no mention of nuclear in each. To reach the goal, if you look at what we're now producing in solar per year, it will take 100 years to reach the goal that we claim we want to reach in 10. So I guess my question is, what's going to be done to ramp up the solar industry and the transmission lines that it's going to need enough to reach that goal, and so that it's not a fantasy but a reality?
Anybody?
Well, again, I really ask you to appreciate what has already been done in terms of momentum and the amount of renewables that's already under contract. I would not characterize the plan as just being offshore wind and solar. As I said, we're going to need all the renewable resources that we can get. And the plan also involves, as we talked about, increasing energy efficiency. Also have talked about, I think, an increasing emphasis on these alternative fuels. And look, it's ultimately going to come down to what the governor decides he wants to do from a policy standpoint in terms of the next level of support for the nuclear industry. The law opens a possible door to the nuclear industry, and as I said, the nuclear industry, nobody is going to build even with a pretty high cost of carbon, nobody's going to build a Westinghouse reactor in the United States. So it is going to be the next generation of nuclear power plants that are going to be built, and we'll see what happens over the next couple of years. This is not a 20-year time horizon. We'll see over the next several years what the progress is in small nuclear reactors and cost.
Well, thank you, panelists. Thank you all for attending here tonight. And when you leave, please walk or take the subway.